Previously in Hedge Knights, the Adlets in the castle planned to convert the tea fields to two separate bison pastures for them to freely roam. Large bears showed up to the glade, but were held at bay by the perimeter walls. Tangier and Sapo became ill, stricken with bubonic plague. Sapo was quicker to recover, while Tangier, due to complications with pregnancy, became bedridden. Megahoof, Madzi, and Dave arrived to find a ruin built into a small mountain guarded by visitors. They dispatched the visitors and made camp by a clean field of ferns. Episode 41: Into the Ruins. Shellbell was distraught and gripped with anxiety, seeing his mother bedridden, nearly too weak to speak. He had always known her to be tough and strong, able to haul armloads of cut slate blocks or drive nails cleanly through dense wood. Despite Sapo's reassurances or Klein's calming presence, his deepest fears festered like blight rot in his mind. He busied himself with chores to occupy the time, hoping for her fever to break soon. Sapo offered the same reassurances for Lazarus that despite being quite sick, she was in fact recovering and the worst of it was behind them. And with the rapport that the two of them had, the news set Lazarus's mind at ease. Lazarus abruptly changed the subject, and suggested they harvest the last of the crop before it got any colder. Sapo stood stunned for a moment. He couldn't believe that Lazarus had the composure to consider the Devil Strand crop with everything going on. But then, after a moment of stunned silence, he nodded his head in agreement. The adventuring trio slept lightly in their cozy rolls, Megahoof only partially asleep and contemplating their strategy for breaching the ruin. There was no telling how many visitors guarded the ruins. They needed to tread carefully and plan accordingly. With prowling bears moved on to easier prey, Judea lifted the order to shelter in place. Burlap sacks of toxic topsoil were strewn around the western fields, awaiting hauling to the boundary salix. Lazarus and Klein were shoulder to shoulder trying to clean the remaining polluted soil from the western wall of the castle grounds. The Adlets were getting closer to realizing their dream of having an open bison paddock. When Megahoof felt ready to get out of bed, he decided to cut down 2 of the rat palm trees to fashion a simple horseshoe pin, so when they weren't fighting for their lives in the dark, swampy ruin, they could blow off some steam. The kind gesture wasn't received well. The 2 other Adlets soon awoke from the noise of sawing and crackling wood, but laid in bed, still groggy from an uncomfortable night of high-anxiety sleep. Tangier was too weak to stand, bedridden, and needed tending to. Despite how it appeared, Sapo again reassured Lazarus that she was pulling through. This was just the last wave of high fever before she would recover. He had gone through the same final wave of high fever just a few days prior. Sapo told him that she'd be on her feet in just a few hours, provided she stayed well hydrated, so Lazarus brought some extra water to leave by her nightstand. Megahoof told Madzi, who had just gotten up, that he was making a horseshoe pin so they could play in their spare time. Madzi looked confused and repeated back what he had said, but with a question. Spare time? Megahoof chuckled and reminded her that not everything had to be taken so seriously all the time. They'd be in the thick of it in the ruins shortly, so she should make the most of the time she had now. She said she was hungry, and as soon as she mentioned food, Dave stood up, clearly having listened to the entire conversation. They pooled what little food they had amongst them to share. Megahoof mentioned they needed a plan to clear the ruins, but Dave said he already had one. He planned to take off some of his bulky clothing so he could run faster, and lure the dim-witted visitors out in the open one by one. Megahoof made sure Dave was okay with this plan, but he was Crazy Dave, after all, for a reason. If they were overrun, they were to flee into the woods and regroup to the north where they had crossed the last river. Dave told Madzi and Megahoof to hide amongst the rat palms while he would try to breach the front gates, which appeared to be in complete disrepair. They were surprised that no visitors had checked in on the 2 gate guards, It was unlikely the skirmish was silent enough to avoid detection. Megahoof worried the remaining visitors had laid a trap just beyond the front gate, awaiting them to venture forth. Without proper tools, Dave realized the breach would take at least 2 people and called for Megahoof to help. Madzi sunk her head low into the brush and scanned the horizon for any approaching enemies, while Megahoof and Dave loudly worked to clear the entrance debris. Dave and Megahoof finally cleared enough rubble to peer into the ruins, only to see a giant pile of broken bricks piled up. Megahoof shared his worry with Dave that the visitors may have laid a trap, and wondered if the debris before them was originally a trap that had been triggered on accident. They could still hear movement on the other side of the pile, so they worked carefully so as to not leave themselves vulnerable to enemy arrow fire. With enough bricks removed, what was left of the pile crumbled away to reveal 2 visitors sleeping side by side, completely undisturbed by the cacophony of tumbling rubble. Megahoof and Dave took a few steps back and lined up a shot on the slumbering monsters, striking the closer one. They retreated towards Madzi, signaling her to be ready, and fired another volley on the guard who had stopped, of all things, to eat bread. A second volley felled the guard, and the bread dropped to his side while the trio cautiously approached. Deep within the ruins' entryway, a bowman crouched behind some stone rubble, ready to fire on the adlets. They scattered and sought cover. The smaller adlets easily dipped behind the rocky outcropping, while the hulking visitor made for an easy target at the end of the narrow corridor. Dave crouched low and approached the closed slab door and joined Megahoof in the fray, while Madzi hung back under orders. The 4th visitor had been slain, and Dave bent down and grabbed the loaf of bread that had dropped. He sniffed it with his keen sense of smell, and despite being a little moldy, much to his surprise, it was clearly made of wheat and maki. He told Megahoof he would take the risk and eat it. Megahoof nodded and told Madzi they both should grab some maki rations too. While Megahoof and Madzi ate, Dave decided to clear a path into the ruins so they could retreat quickly. Once he was done, he carefully listened for voices through the walls and doors, and decided to breach towards the south through the dilapidated slab door. Madzi and Megahoof could hear Dave breaching further into the ruins and scarf their food so they could return to the corridor entrance with weapons ready. Meanwhile, Tangier was back on her feet, having made a precarious recovery. Everyone was relieved, especially Shellbell and Lazarus. Just as Sappho reassured, her fever broke, but she still felt considerably weakened and needed extra rest, given her due date was fast approaching. With the double strand harvested, the fence for the bison enclosure could be completed, and soon they would be moved to the much larger pasture. Madzi whispered to Megahoof if he thought he should go help Dave. Megahoof whispered back that Dave could just as easily ask for help if he wanted it, but he seemed eager to dismantle the bricks himself, and they could support him if they encountered visitors better from the entry of the corridor anyway. Madzi then quietly asked, "You just don't want to lift all those blocks, right?" And Megahoof shrugged and nodded. Having finally broken through the slab door, Dave poked his head into the new corridor and saw closed doors but no signs of visitors, and gave a quick hand signal to the other 2 that it was all clear before splintering his way through the door across the hall. Immediately after taking the door off his hinges, Dave leapt backwards from a massive swipe aimed at his head. The noise alerted the other 2 as Dave nimbly sprinted up the corridor, avoiding detritus and debris. He hand-signaled to Megahoof that he was going to dodge left. Luckily, Madzi understood as well. Just as he dodged, the archers released well-aimed arrows and quickly felled the halberdier. Dave heard the telltale clank of a crossbow locking into place from the adjacent room, and as he approached to peek, the slab door to his left began to creak open, so he darted back towards the entranceway. Megahoof and Madzi saw the entering visitor heading to have a meal and decided to rush up towards the broken door to take aim at him while he was unaware. Just as they readied themselves for the ambush, Dave had already loosed an arrow, and it struck the swordsman. The three fled back towards the outside, hoping to lure the blade-wielding monster to its death. The crossbowman hadn't followed the swordsman, and despite two of its own dying, it seemed unconcerned about the adlet's efforts. Dave told the others to sit tight. He would attempt to lure the last monster out into the open, rather than risk anyone being struck by a high-velocity bolt. Having been struck by Dave's arrow, the crossbowman attempted to take cover behind the doorframe, but since the heavy doors were cumbersome, Dave easily slipped out of view. Using the guerrilla tactics he had honed while fighting as a mercenary, he continually harassed the visitor with a well-timed barrage of arrows, throwing the enemy into a panicked confusion. Between volleys, he threw a quick OK hand signal at Megahoof before holding up a second finger, indicating approaching backup. Megahoof told Madzi to be ready. He waved the two closer and told them the crossbowman was down, but he heard a single set of footsteps across the hall and wanted them clued in that he was luring another enemy out. Unlike the crossbowman, the axe wielder was eager to pursue. Dave yelled for the others to fall back. Hot on Dave's heels was the axeman, ducking and weaving the first few arrows. Megahoof yelled for them to scatter. The three fanned out, putting distance between them and the approaching monstrosity. Seeing the odds tipped against him, the axeman retreated back into the ruins. As the trio approached the entrance, the axe wielder was nowhere to be found, having disappeared deep into the structure, likely lying in wait for a timely ambush. Knowing they had wounded him and that on foot he was likely faster than him now, Dave told the others to wait, and he'd go carefully peeking around corners hoping to lure him out. Dave ran for cover while the others both gravely wounded the pursuer. With the last of his effort, the visitor dodged the next few attacks as he berserked ever closer to the trio. Megahoof yelled for Madzi to fall back as Dave landed a fatal blow with a piece of granite stone from the rubble pile. Dave gasped to catch his breath, and then mumbled, "11 hells, that was close," while Madzi stumbled backwards, a bit stunned, having dodged a flurry of desperate axe swipes. Megahoof regained his composure, and as calmly as he could said, "We're getting sloppy. I think it's time for us to break for camp," while the other two double-checked the entrance corridor for more enemies, and then slung their bows on their back, heading for the fern patch. Madzi still had post-battle jitters and needed to blow off steam before attempting to sleep. As odd as it seemed watching Megahoof set up a horseshoe pin during their siege of the ruin, she now understood the value of creature comforts, especially in a time of crisis. Tangier couldn't sleep. The discomfort of her pregnancy, paired with the aches and pains of a protracted recovery, meant that she was suffering from insomnia. Despite being the Adlet's best miner, she found it to be boring and monotonous, which was the perfect sort of activity to induce the tiredness she was hoping to achieve. Lazarus awoke in the middle of the night, wondering where his wife had gone. Faintly off in the distance, he could hear pick strikes upon slate, even through the loud rolling thunder, and with Madzi away, he then knew she was in the mines. He worried about the ordeal she had just endured. He was used to being this staunch defender of the community, but plague and illness was not the sort of attack he was prepared to thwart. At that very moment, they both were worried about the well-being of their unborn child and how Shellbell would handle being an older sibling. While they both worked tirelessly to shape the world into a better place for their children, there was no doubt the future was fraught with countless dangers. Tangier returned to her bedchambers having partially decluttered her mind. She saw that Lazarus was also awake, and as she entered, he asked if she was okay. She nodded and offered a perfunctory smile, an unspoken symbol that she wasn't okay, but also was not ready to talk about it either. He knew she needed to decompress, and she could read his understanding, even in the dimly lit room. Megahoof awoke, drenched in rainwater, and saw the other two had pulled the water-resistant hide bedrolls over their heads to stay more dry. He contemplated trying to carve out a little nook in the ruins to sleep in instead, but realized making a temporary lean-to for shelter was most certainly the safer option. He had rested enough and stood guard, awaiting for the others to awake. The neutral fungal farm was abuzz with activity. The caps were ready for harvest, and the farmers were eagerly trimming the spores, readying them for the bison barns. Klein asked what Lazarus intended to do with the newly harvested devil strand. Lazarus intended to use it as an outer layer for the protective clothing, especially for the hoods, in order to offer both decent physical protection paired with something to allow for better breathing during the smogs. But if there was enough for other articles of clothing, he tried to make cloaks, gloves, and boots as well. Megahoof waited for everyone to fully wake up, and then led the charge back into the ruins. While Dave was removing his bulky clothing, Megahoof suggested that Madzi take off her gloves. Using a bow with thick gloves was rather difficult, so they both set their pairs aside. The trio had already dispatched almost half a dozen guards, all while never getting struck by arrow fire or slashing blades. Megahoof commended their efforts so far, but pressed them both to exercise extreme caution, as not all of the visitors were equally simple-minded, so they ought to expect traps and ambushes alike. Dave scouted ahead and found a slumbering guard. He knocked an arrow back, and in the low light and winding corridors, it pinged off the walls. The next arrow landed squarely in the enemy's thick gambeson. Dave tactfully retreated back towards the entrance. He looked towards Megahoof to ask whether or not he saw the spearmen pursue him, but neither Megahoof nor Madzi could see that far into the corridor. They both shook their heads. Dave asked them to cover him. He was going to tear apart one of the two main doors. He was hoping it would lead out of the winding tunnel systems. Madzi asked Megahoof what he would do if they didn't find any tomes or books within the ruins. Megahoof's response surprised her. Even if their mission was a failure, the information he had already gleaned from their encounters within the ruins was valuable. The visitors ate bread and slept, cohabitated within shelter, but showed very little regard for one another. While their motivations weren't known, they seemed to behave more civilly here in the ruins than when they rampaged towards the castle, hell-bent on blood. These insights were valuable. Understanding your enemy can reveal weaknesses sometimes stronger than the advantage of steel. Dave signaled them to approach. He had breached the main gates, but it led yet again to a forking path of barricaded doors. His frustration was visibly mounting. Megahoof helped Dave breach the next door and told Madzi to stand clear and keep watch. Madzi noticed a raccoon wandering the corridors, a hopeful sign that there might be food within the ruins, as the adventuring trio was sorely needing supplementary provisions for their return trip home. Madzi asked what they found, and Dave uttered one word: disappointment. Megahoof then called for them to hush. He heard the creaking of a door off in the distance. They crouched behind some stone chunks, lying in wait. They shot an armor-clad enemy holding a bread loaf, so bewildered he never even flinched as he was struck. They continued to fire, taking advantage of the seemingly brain-dead enemy, until he collapsed in a pile of rusty armor. Dave and Megahoof took advantage of the pilfered bread, while Madzi chipped away at the adjacent door, eager to help her two elders. Dave asked Megahoof if he had any clue as to why some of the enemies seemed to be sleepwalking, but Megahoof couldn't even speculate a hypothesis. Dave laughed and told Madzi the door she was breaking down wasn't even barricaded, and told the others to take up fighting positions while he slid it open. Off in the distance, Meghoof and Madzi could hear Dave grumble, 11 hells, more hallways? And then the grinding noise of another slab door, paired with even more cuss-laden grumbling. He stomped past them while he mumbled, "Gonna try those wooden doors," as his voice trailed off in the dark. He was clearly frustrated, as the ruin seemed to be nothing more than a stupid labyrinth of small corridors. Off in the distance, they could hear him finally utter, "Aha!" followed by a, "Come towards my voice." From beyond a pile of slab granite, they could hear his voice. He said they needed to bust this door down so they could go deeper into the ruin, while also maintaining a more straight path towards retreat. Meghoof made sure Dave wasn't trapped. Dave told him he was just beyond the door to the south, and that he also found some shelves with old books that looked promising. The trio had carefully and methodically traversed the well-guarded corridors of the ruins, and finally their efforts may have paid off. Meghoof couldn't wait to leaf through the pages of the tomes Dave had found, and then delve further deeper into the winding catacombs. Thank you for tuning in to Hedge Knights episode 41, Into the Ruins. If you would like to support me as a content creator, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this content with your friends. If you would like to support me more directly, please consider becoming one of my Patreon patrons. A link to Patreon can be found in the description of this video. If you would like to join my online gaming community on Discord, a link can be found to that as well. Thank you so very much for watching, and a special thank you to my Patreon patrons, Twitch subscribers, and viewers like you that support the channel. I hope to catch you next episode. Farewell.